Before I tell you what I found in that room, I need you to do something for me. Press that like button right now, because where this story is going, you are going to want to have already pressed it. Subscribe too, because I have more stories like this one, and I do not tell them anywhere else. And I want to know something. Down in the comments, tell me where in the world you are listening to this from. I read every single one. I have readers and listeners from places I have never even seen on a map, and that still amazes an old woman like me. Now settle in, get comfortable, maybe pour yourself something warm to drink, and let me tell you about the day I went back to that clinic, and what I found waiting for me there. I suppose to tell this story right, I need to start much further back than the day I walked through those doors at 24. I need to start with the girl I was before any of this happened, because you cannot understand what a flag on a piece of paper took from me unless you understand what my life looked like before that paper existed. I was born the fourth of 8 children on a dairy farm, in a settlement that had been there, in one form or another, since before my grandparents were children themselves. We were not the strictest of communities, but we were not the loosest either. We fell somewhere in the middle, a place that outsiders rarely understand, because to them Amish is Amish, one single picture in their minds, buggies and bonnets and nothing more. But within our world there were many different ways of living, many different rules from one church district to the next, and ours had its own particular rhythm. My earliest memories are of the barn before sunrise. My father would wake my older brothers first, and then, as I got old enough, he would wake me too, and we would walk out together into the cold dark, our breath showing in front of our faces, the cows already shifting and lowing in their stalls, waiting for us. I loved that time of day more than almost any other. There was a stillness to it, a kind of secret world that existed only in those hours before the rest of the household stirred. Just me and my father and the animals and the particular smell of hay and manure and cold metal that I can still call up in my mind even now, decades later, sitting somewhere far from any farm. My mother ran the house the way a general runs an army, though she would have laughed at that comparison and scolded me gently for the pride in it. 8 children require an extraordinary amount of organization, and my mother had it. She knew, without seeming to think about it, whose stockings needed mending, and whose stomach was the delicate one that week, and which of us was old enough to be trusted with the good scissors. She was tired more often than not. I understand that now as a grown woman in a way I could not understand it as a child, but she rarely let that tiredness show as anything other than a kind of quiet efficiency. We went to school in a one-room schoolhouse about 1.5 miles from our farm, walking there in all weather, our lunch pails swinging at our sides. I was, if I am honest with you, a good student, though the education we received stopped at the 8th grade, as was our way, and after that the school of life took over, as my father used to say. For me that meant more work on the farm, more responsibility in the house, and eventually, as I moved into my teenage years, a kind of narrowing of the world that I did not fully notice happening until it had already happened. I do not say that with resentment. I want to be careful here, because I know some people who tell stories about leaving Amish life like to paint the whole of it as a prison, and I do not believe that, and I do not want you to think that is what I am telling you. There was so much good in that life. There was a closeness in my family that I have rarely found anywhere else since. There was a sense of purpose in the work, a satisfaction in seeing a garden you planted feed your family through a winter, a joy in singing together on a Sunday that I have never quite replicated in any English church I have visited since. I do not regret having been raised that way. I only regret certain things that happened within it, and certain doors that closed to me because of choices that were made on my behalf. I want to tell you a little more about that childhood before I move forward in the story, because I think it helps explain why the words on that clinic note cut so deeply when I finally read them at 24. It is one thing to hear an abstract description of a restrictive, concerning household. It is another thing entirely to hold that description up against your own actual memories and find them so completely at odds with one another. I remember the barn raisings most vividly of all the community gatherings from my childhood. When a neighbor's barn burned, or when a young couple newly married needed one built for their own start in farming, word would travel through the district, and on the appointed day, wagons and buggies would come from every direction, arriving before the sun was fully up, men and older boys already talking through the framework of the day's work, while the women began setting up long tables under the shade of whatever trees stood nearby. I was put to work in those early years carrying water, and later, as I grew, helping with the enormous quantities of food that needed preparing to feed dozens of hungry workers through a long day of labor. I remember the specific joy of watching an entire barn go up in a single day, walls raised by hand, rafters set, the structure standing complete by sundown, where that morning there had been only a foundation and a pile of lumber. There is a kind of magic in that, in watching an entire community pour its collective strength into a single family's need, asking nothing in return beyond the understanding that the same would be done for them someday, when their own need arose. I remember the Sunday singings too, held in whichever family's home was hosting church that particular week, benches cleared and rearranged from the morning service, the young people gathering in the evening to sing from the old hymnals, voices layered together in a way that had no need of instruments, the sound rising up through the rafters of whatever farmhouse we happened to be in that night. I was, I will admit, not the strongest singer among my siblings, but I loved those evenings more than almost anything else in my young life, the particular warmth of being surrounded by dozens of familiar faces, all of us there simply because we wanted to be. No obligation forcing our attendance beyond our own desire to sing together. I remember my oldest brother's wedding, when I was perhaps 12 years old, the enormous undertaking of feeding the entire district that gathered for the celebration, my mother directing a kitchen full of women with the calm authority of someone who had clearly done this many times before and would do it many times again. I remember my brother's face that day, a happiness I had rarely seen in him before, usually so serious and steady in his manner, and I remember thinking, even at 12, that whatever else might be true about our way of life, there was a depth of community celebration in it that I sensed even then might be rare in the wider world beyond our fields. I remember, too, harder things, because I do not want to paint a picture that is only golden and untroubled, since no honest picture of any childhood could be only that. I remember a particular winter when my youngest brother, only 4 years old at the time, fell seriously ill with a fever that would not break for nearly a week, and I remember my parents' fear, quiet but unmistakable, as my mother sat up through 3 consecutive nights pressing cool cloths to his forehead, my father pacing the kitchen in a way I had never seen him do before or since. I remember the relief that finally broke over the household when the fever passed, my mother weeping openly at the kitchen table in a way I had never witnessed from her, my father's hand resting on her shoulder, both of them simply grateful, in that unguarded moment, that their child had survived. I remember, too, the particular ache of watching an older cousin go through her Rumspringa, the period of increased freedom granted to some young people in certain communities before they choose, formally, whether to be baptized into the church. And I remember the confusion I felt at 12 or 13, watching her come and go with English friends, wearing clothes I had never imagined our family would permit, and then, eventually, watching her choose to return fully to the community, to be baptized, to marry within our district, settling into a life that looked, from the outside at least, very much like the one my own mother lived. I did not understand at that age that I was watching a preview of a choice I myself would eventually face, though mine would take me in the opposite direction from hers. I tell you all of this not because it directly explains the medical flag that would eventually shape so much of my 24th year, but because I want you to understand the fullness of what that flag reduced to a handful of suspicious phrases. Restricted community. The words themselves are not entirely false, in the narrow sense that our community did have boundaries, did have rules, did limit certain kinds of outside contact in certain ways. But the word restricted, standing alone on a clinical form, carries none of the singing, none of the barn raisings, none of the collective grief and collective joy that actually filled the days of my childhood. It carries none of my mother's 3 sleepless nights beside my brother's fever, none of my father's pacing, none of the particular tenderness with which an entire community would drop its own work to help a family in need without being asked. A single word, chosen by someone who had spent perhaps 20 minutes with my family during the worst crisis of my young life, cannot hold the true weight of an entire childhood. And yet that single word entered into a database, carried enough institutional weight to shape 13 weeks of my adult life, 7 years later, in a way that the actual truth of my childhood never had the opportunity to counterbalance. By the time I was 17, I had settled into a kind of rhythm. Up before dawn for the milking, breakfast with the family, all of us packed around the long wooden table, my father saying grace in our dialect before anyone touched their food. Chores through the morning, garden work in the summer, canning in the late summer and fall, sewing and mending in whatever hours were left in the evening. I had 2 younger sisters who followed me everywhere, and I did not mind it, mostly, though there were days I longed for a moment entirely alone, a longing I think most people from large families understand, whatever their background. It was in the late spring of that year that the pains started. I do not remember the very first twinge, because it was so mild I dismissed it as something I had eaten or a muscle strained from lifting feed buckets. But over the following weeks it grew, a dull ache low on my right side that would flare into something sharper without warning, sometimes while I was bent over the washtub, sometimes in the middle of the night, waking me from sleep with a gasp I tried to muffle so as not to wake my sisters in the bed beside mine. I did not tell my mother right away. This was partly stubbornness, the kind that I think lives in most 17-year-olds regardless of what community raised them, a wish to handle things on my own, to not be a bother. But it was also something else, something harder to explain. There was, in our way of thinking, a kind of quiet shame attached to illness. Not shame in the sense of wrongdoing, but a sense that complaining about your body was a form of vanity, of drawing attention to yourself that a humble person should not seek. So I bore it as long as I could, going about my chores with my jaw clenched, telling myself it would pass. It did not pass. It got worse, and one morning, while I was doubled over near the chicken coop trying to catch my breath, my mother found me there, and the look on her face told me immediately that my secret, such as it was, had come to an end. She took my chin in her hand and studied my face, and I remember her asking me, in our language, how long I had been hurting like this. And I remember the way my voice cracked when I finally admitted it had been weeks, not days. She did not scold me. I want to be clear about that, because I think sometimes people imagine Amish mothers as stern and unfeeling, and mine was neither of those things in that moment. She simply pulled me into her, held me for a long moment against her apron, which smelled of bread and lye soap, and then she told me we needed to see a doctor, an English doctor, because whatever this was, it was beyond what she or the local midwife could safely manage. I want you to understand what a significant decision that was for my mother to make, and how quickly she made it, because it tells you something about how frightened she truly was. Going to an English doctor was not something taken lightly in our home. It meant money we did not easily have. It meant exposure to a world that made us feel like curiosities, animals in a zoo that people stared at through car windows as they drove past our buggies. It meant paperwork, forms, questions we were not accustomed to answering. But my mother did not hesitate, not for one moment, once she understood how much pain I was truly in. And I have thought of that moment many times since, because it stands in such stark contrast to what would later be written about her in a stranger's clipboard notes. My father hitched the buggy, and we set off for the clinic on the edge of town, my mother beside me in the back, her hand resting on my knee the entire ride, steadying me over every bump in the road. It took the better part of an hour to get there, and by the time we arrived I was sweating and pale and could barely sit upright. The clinic itself was a squat brick building that had clearly been built sometime in the 70s, with a gravel parking lot that crunched under the buggy wheels, and a waiting room that smelled of hand sanitizer laid thick over old carpet. I remember the receptionist's face when we walked in, the particular flicker of surprise and curiosity that crossed it before she composed herself into professional politeness. We got looks like that everywhere we went in town, and ordinarily I would have simply lowered my eyes and let it pass over me the way I had been taught, but that day I was in too much pain to care what anyone thought. They took me back within 20 minutes, faster than usual I think, because even the receptionist could see something was seriously wrong. A doctor with tired eyes and a clipped, efficient manner examined my abdomen, pressing in places that made me cry out despite myself, and he ordered blood work and an ultrasound without much delay. I remember lying on a table while a young technician ran a cold wand across my stomach, her eyes fixed on a screen turned away from me, her face carefully blank in the way I have since learned medical people are trained to keep their faces when they see something concerning. It turned out to be my appendix, dangerously close to rupturing. The doctor came back with the results and spoke quickly, urgently to my mother, using words I did not fully understand at the time, words like acute and surgical intervention and within the hour. My mother, to her enormous credit, did not argue, did not hesitate, simply nodded and asked what she needed to sign. and I remember her hand shaking slightly as she held the pen, because she could not read English cursive quickly and was doing her best to make sense of a consent form under enormous pressure, while her daughter lay in pain on a gurney beside her. They took me back for surgery within the hour, just as the doctor had said. My father was still out in the far fields that day, having stayed behind to look after the farm and the younger children while my mother brought me in. And so my mother sat alone in that waiting room for nearly 4 hours, not knowing anyone in that town, not having a telephone to call anyone with, simply waiting, the way she has told me since that she has never waited for anything in her whole life, before or since. I woke up groggy, my throat raw from the tube they had put down it during the surgery, my stomach sore in a new and unfamiliar way. A nurse checked on me periodically, taking my vitals, adjusting my IV, and at some point, once I was awake enough to speak in full sentences, she sat down in the chair beside my bed with a clipboard and began asking me questions. I did not think anything of it at the time. I was 17, groggy from anesthesia, raised to answer adults honestly and respectfully, and so when she asked whether I felt safe at home, I said yes, without hesitation, because it was true. When she asked whether anyone hurt me, I said no, also true. When she asked whether my parents made me work more than other children my age, I told her, honestly, that I worked hard, that we all did, that this was simply how our life was, how it had always been, how I expected it would continue to be. I told her I milked cows before school and helped can vegetables in the fall and mended clothes in the evenings, and I said it the way you might describe the weather, as simply a fact of my existence, not a complaint. She wrote for a long time on that clipboard. I remember watching her pen move and thinking nothing of it, assuming it was simply routine paperwork, the kind of thing hospitals seem to generate endlessly for every small thing. She smiled at me when she finished, a smile that I would later come to understand did not quite reach her eyes, and she left the room, and I did not think of her again for 7 years. I want to tell you a little more about those 2 days in the hospital, because I think they matter, small as they might seem against the larger sweep of this story. I remember the strange disorientation of that hospital room, so unlike anything in my own home, the bed that rose and lowered at the press of a button, the television mounted high on the wall that I did not know how to operate and did not particularly want to, the constant hum and beep of machines I did not understand monitoring parts of my body I had never before had cause to think about in such clinical terms. I remember my mother sleeping in the chair beside my bed both nights, refusing the cot the staff offered her, saying she preferred to be close enough to reach out and touch my hand if I stirred, and I remember waking in the deep of the second night to find her exactly there, her hand resting lightly over mine, her own head tipped back against the chair in an uncomfortable-looking sleep that could not have given her much real rest. I remember feeling, even through the fog of pain medication, a fierce love for her in that moment, a certainty that whatever this strange English building was, whatever strange English questions its staff might ask, I was safe simply because she was there beside me. I remember, too, a kind, older nurse, not the one who would later write the note that changed so much, but a different woman entirely, who came in on the second morning to check my incision, and who spent several extra minutes simply talking with me, asking about the farm, about my siblings, about what I hoped to do once I was grown, listening to my answers with what seemed like genuine warmth and curiosity rather than clinical suspicion. I remember thinking, in the simple way a 17-year-old thinks, that all English medical staff were probably like her, kind and curious without judgment, and it would be years before I understood how differently that single hospital stay had actually been recorded by a different set of hands entirely. We went home 2 days later, once the doctors were satisfied I was healing well. My mother nursed me through the recovery with the same quiet competence she brought to everything, and within a few weeks I was back to my chores, a little more carefully at first, and then, eventually, entirely as before. The whole episode faded into the general blur of memory, one hospital stay among the handful most people experience in a lifetime, notable mostly for the fear of it and the relief of recovery, nothing more. I did not know, and would not know for 7 more years, that a note had been entered into a permanent medical file with my name on it that day. A note that described my family's hesitation in that waiting room, not as the fear and unfamiliarity it actually was, but as evasiveness. A note that took my honest 17-year-old description of farm chores and translated it, through a filter of unfamiliarity and suspicion, into language about possible undisclosed labor concerns. A note that flagged my community itself as a kind of risk factor, as though the entire culture that had raised me with such care was inherently a threat to my well-being. That note sat there, dormant, unexamined, unresolved, for 7 years. While I grew up, while my life changed in ways no one in that clinic could have predicted, waiting for the day I would walk back through those doors. I want to take some time now to tell you about those 7 years, because I think they matter to this story every bit as much as what happened when I was 17 and what happened when I was 24. They are the years in which I became the person who would eventually sit in that windowless room and learn what had been written about my family. The years between 17 and 20 came and went the way years do in a farming community, marked more by seasons than by birthdays. I turned 18 in the deep of winter, helping my mother render lard in the kitchen while snow piled against the windows. I turned 19 during haying season, sunburned and exhausted, my hands calloused in a way that felt, at the time, like the most natural thing in the world. But somewhere in those years, a restlessness began to grow in me that I did not have words for at first. It was not a rejection of my family, or of my faith, or even really of the work itself. It was something quieter and harder to name, a sense that there were questions I was not permitted to ask, doors I was not permitted to open, simply because I was a young woman in a community where certain paths were considered closed, before you were even old enough to know you might want to walk them. I remember the exact moment I first articulated this feeling to myself, though I told no one else for a long while after. I was 20 years old, sitting on the porch after evening chores, watching the light fade over the fields, and I found myself wondering, with a suddenness that almost frightened me, what my life would look like if I had been born a boy in an English family in the town nearby. Would I have gone to a real school beyond the 8th grade? Would I have been allowed to ask questions about the world beyond our fields without being gently redirected back to more practical matters? It was not that I believed my life was without value as it was. It was that I began to suspect I had never truly been given a choice in the matter, that the life I was living had simply been assigned to me at birth, and that questioning it at all felt, within our community, like a kind of betrayal. I want to be careful here, because I know this part of my story can be misunderstood. Leaving was not a single decision made in a single moment. It was a slow unraveling that took place over nearly 2 years, full of doubt, full of guilt, full of nights spent crying quietly into my pillow because I loved my family desperately, and could not understand why loving them and needing something more for myself felt like they could not coexist. There was a young English woman, a school teacher who had moved into a farmhouse near ours, and who I met at a local farmer's market where I sometimes helped sell my mother's preserves. Her name was Karen, and she was kind to me in a way that asked nothing of me, that did not try to change me, that simply treated me as a person with thoughts worth hearing. We began talking slowly, over the course of many market Saturdays, and eventually she lent me books, carefully, discreetly, knowing what it might mean for me if my parents discovered them. I read those books at night, by the light of a small battery lamp I hid beneath my mattress, and something in me that had been dormant for years began to wake up. I do not say this to suggest that reading books made me a better or wiser person than my family, who read almost nothing beyond scripture and farming almanacs. I only say that it opened a door in my mind that I found I could not close again once it had been opened. By the time I was 22, I knew I was going to leave, even though I had not yet told anyone, even though I did not yet know how or when. The knowledge sat in me like a stone, heavy and constant, through another full year of chores and church and family meals, all of which I participated in with a kind of aching tenderness, because some part of me already understood I was saying goodbye to them, one ordinary day at a time, long before I ever packed a bag. I remember the night before I left with a clarity that has never faded, not even after all these years. I lay awake long past midnight in the bed I shared with my youngest sister, listening to her steady breathing beside me, memorizing, without quite realizing that was what I was doing, the particular pattern of moonlight falling across the quilt my grandmother had made, the sound of the wind moving through the trees outside our window, the faint smell of the wood stove still cooling in the kitchen below. I did not sleep at all that night, I think, though I must have dozed at some point, because I remember waking with a start well before the rooster's first call, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and resolve so tightly wound together I could not have separated them if I tried. I packed only what would fit in a single bag, mostly practical things. A few changes of clothes, my grandmother's recipe cards, a small amount of money I had saved over the preceding year from selling preserves at the market, hidden away for this exact purpose without my parents' knowledge. I remember standing in the doorway of the bedroom I shared with my sisters for one final moment before I left, watching them sleep, feeling a grief so enormous it nearly changed my mind right there in that doorway, before I forced myself to turn and walk down the stairs and out into the cold, dark morning where Karen was waiting for me at the end of our lane, her car engine idling quietly so as not to wake the household. I left on a Tuesday morning in early autumn, the fields around our farm turning gold, the air carrying that particular crispness that always meant harvest was near. I left a letter for my parents, because I could not bear to say the words to their faces, knowing I would lose my courage if I saw the pain in my mother's eyes. Karen helped me. She had a cousin in a town 40 miles away who needed help at a bakery, and she drove me there herself in her car, my first time ever riding in an automobile for more than a few minutes, my hands gripping the door handle the entire way, half from fear of the speed and half from the enormity of what I was doing. I will not pretend that first year away was anything but hard. It was the hardest year of my life, harder even than the year that would come later, when I sat in that windowless room at the clinic. I did not know how to use a telephone properly. I did not know how to fill out a job application. I did not know how to drive, how to use a bank account, how to navigate a grocery store with its endless aisles of choices that felt, at first, less like abundance and more like a kind of paralysis. I cried more in that first year than I had in the previous 10 combined, missing my mother's hands, my father's low voice at the breakfast table, my sister's laughter drifting through the walls at night. But slowly, the way a broken bone slowly knits itself back together, I began to build something. Karen's cousin, a woman named Denise, owned the bakery, and she took a particular interest in me, more than simple employment required. She was patient in a way I will never forget, teaching me how to use the register, how to read a work schedule, how to fill out the forms that seemed to multiply endlessly in English life. She never once made me feel foolish for not knowing things that most people her own age had learned as children. She treated my ignorance of the English world the same way she might have treated a foreign exchange student's imperfect grasp of the language, with patience rather than judgment. I found an apartment above the hardware store 2 doors down from the bakery, small and plain, with a single window that looked out over the main street. And I remember the first night I spent there alone, lying on a mattress on the floor because I had not yet been able to afford a bed frame, staring at the ceiling and feeling, for the first time in my life, entirely, terrifyingly, wonderfully responsible for myself. I want to tell you about a few specific moments from that first year, because I think the general description of hardship I gave you does not quite capture the particular texture of what it was like to rebuild a life from nothing, in a world whose rules I had to learn from scratch, often through embarrassment before I ever learned them properly. I remember my first trip to a proper grocery store, sometime in my second week in town, sent there by Denise with a short list of ingredients for the bakery's morning order. I stood in the baking aisle for what must have been 15 full minutes, staring at a wall of flour I could not make sense of, bleached and unbleached, all-purpose and bread flour and self-rising, brands I had never heard of stacked in bags of every size, and I felt a wave of panic rise in me that seems almost comical to me now, but felt in that moment entirely overwhelming. I had spent my whole life until then buying flour in bulk from a single mill a few miles from our farm, a transaction that involved perhaps 2 sentences of conversation with a man my father had known for decades. Here, in this store, under lights so bright they seemed to erase all shadow, I was expected to choose correctly among dozens of options I did not understand, and I remember standing there with my list clutched in my hand, feeling tears prick at my eyes before a kind older woman, noticing my distress, asked if I needed help finding something, and gently walked me through the choice. I remember, too, the particular loneliness of my first Thanksgiving away from my family, a holiday I had never celebrated in quite the same way growing up, since our own community marked gratitude in its own ways throughout the year, rather than concentrating it into a single November feast. Denise invited me to spend the day with her own family, an act of kindness I will never forget. But I remember sitting at her table that afternoon, surrounded by her husband and her grown children, and a noisy, affectionate chaos of conversation I did not fully know how to participate in, feeling a grief so sharp for my own mother's kitchen, my own siblings' laughter, that I had to excuse myself partway through the meal and stand alone in Denise's backyard for several minutes, breathing the cold November air until I trusted myself to return to the table without weeping. I remember learning to drive, the particular terror of my first time behind the wheel on an actual road, rather than the empty parking lot where Denise had first let me practice. I remember gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached for hours afterward, certain that every car passing in the opposite lane was about to collide with me, certain that the machine beneath me was barely under my control despite Denise's calm voice beside me, insisting I was doing fine, better than fine, that everyone felt exactly this way the first time. I failed my driving test twice before finally passing on the third attempt, and I remember the particular flush of pride I felt walking out of that testing office with my license in hand, a small plastic card that represented, to me, a far larger victory than its modest appearance suggested, proof that I had learned to navigate a piece of the English world entirely on my own initiative. I remember, too, a harder moment, sometime in my first spring away, when a letter finally arrived from my mother, the first communication I had received from my family since leaving. I had written to them several times by then, careful, gentle letters explaining where I was and that I was safe, though I had not yet found the courage to visit in person. My mother's reply was short, her handwriting familiar and aching to see again, and it contained neither the forgiveness I secretly hoped for nor the anger I feared, but something harder to sit with, a kind of controlled grief, a simple acknowledgement that she had received my letter and was glad to know I was safe, followed by a request, gently worded but unmistakable, that I not write again until I was ready to come home for good. I remember sitting on the floor of my small apartment reading that letter over and over, feeling the particular pain of a door not slammed shut but simply left ajar in a way that offered no clear path forward, and it would be nearly a year before I found the courage to write again despite her request, unable to bear the silence any longer. Over the following 2 years, I built a life that, while modest, was entirely my own. I learned to drive, badly at first, and then with growing confidence, in an old sedan that Denise helped me buy for almost nothing from a customer who was upgrading. I learned to manage a bank account, to pay rent on time, to cook for one instead of for 10. I made a few friends, mostly through the bakery, women who did not ask too many questions about where I had come from but who were kind and inclusive in the easy way that English friendships seemed to form, so different from the deep but narrower bonds of my childhood. I did not abandon everything from my old life. I kept my faith, in my own quieter way, praying each night much as I had been taught, though without the structure of the church district I had left behind. I still made my mother's bread recipes, still canned vegetables each fall out of habit as much as necessity, still spoke my first language in my dreams more often than English, even years later. I visited my family exactly once during those first 2 years, a difficult, tearful visit in which my mother held me for a long time without speaking, and my father could barely meet my eyes, caught between love for his daughter and grief over the path she had chosen. It was not a clean reconciliation. There is rarely such a thing when someone leaves the way I left. But it was a beginning, a thread that had not been entirely severed, even if it remained thin and fragile for years afterward. By the time I turned 24, I had, through Denise's help and my own growing confidence, secured proper health insurance through the bakery for the first time in my life. This was, in itself, a small miracle to me, a piece of paper that meant I would not have to fear the cost of illness the way I once might have. A piece of paper that represented, in its own bureaucratic way, just how far I had come from that girl who once rode in the back of a buggy, pale and doubled over with pain, unable to imagine any life beyond the one she had been born into. It was that spring, the spring I turned 24, that the stomach troubles began again. They were nothing like the appendix pain from 7 years before, thank goodness. This was duller, a persistent aching discomfort just below my ribs, worse in the mornings, sometimes accompanied by a wave of nausea that made it hard to face the smell of the bakery's ovens, which was its own particular kind of cruelty, given where I worked. I tried to manage it myself at first, the old habits of my upbringing reasserting themselves, a reluctance to make a fuss over my own body, but Denise noticed, the way mothers and mother figures always seem to notice, and she pressed me until I admitted how long it had been going on and how much it had begun to worry me. She was the one who suggested the clinic. She did not know, could not have known, that it was the very same clinic where I had my appendix removed all those years before. To her, it was simply the nearest facility that took the insurance she had helped me obtain, a practical suggestion made with genuine care. She even offered to drive me herself, worried, I think, that I might talk myself out of going if left to make the appointment alone. I remember the particular jolt I felt, sitting in her small office behind the bakery kitchen, looking down at the address she had written on a scrap of paper, and realizing slowly, the way you realize you have walked into a room you have been in before but forgotten, that this was the same clinic. The same brick building on the edge of town, though the town itself had grown considerably in 7 years, new shops lining the main street, a proper parking structure now standing where the gravel lot used to crunch under buggy wheels. I told myself it did not matter. 7 years was a long time. I was a different person now, dressed in the plain but modern clothes I had come to favor, my hair no longer covered, driving myself in my own car rather than arriving by buggy. Whatever had happened in that building when I was 17 was surely long forgotten, filed away in whatever way such things were filed away, irrelevant to the young woman I had become. I want to tell you now about the morning I walked back through those doors, because I remember it with a clarity that surprises even me, all these years later. It was a gray Tuesday, the sky the color of dishwater, a light drizzle just beginning as I parked my car in that new structure and walked across the lot toward the entrance. Denise had offered again to come with me, but I had insisted I could manage it alone, wanting, I think, to prove to myself that I had truly become the independent woman I believed myself to be. The waiting room had been renovated since I last saw it. New carpet, new chairs, a television mounted in one corner playing a muted morning show, but underneath the new paint I could still recognize the bones of the same building, and something in my chest tightened as I settled into a chair that felt, absurdly, smaller than I remembered, though of course it was I who had grown, not the furniture. I gave my name and date of birth to the woman at the front desk, expecting nothing more than the ordinary shuffle of paperwork that had become familiar to me over my years of navigating English bureaucracy. She typed for a moment, her eyes fixed on her screen, and I watched, without quite understanding why I was watching so closely, as her expression shifted. It was subtle, the kind of change you might miss if you were not paying attention, but I was paying attention, some old instinct in me already sensing that something was wrong. Her eyebrows lifted just slightly. Her eyes flicked up to my face, then back down to the screen, then up again, longer this time, studying me in a way that felt less like simple curiosity and more like she was comparing what she saw in front of her to something written down that did not quite match. She excused herself, said she needed to check on something, and disappeared through a door behind the reception desk. I sat there watching that door, feeling a cold unease begin to spread through my chest that I could not have named or explained if you had asked me to in that moment. I had done nothing wrong. I was simply a young woman with a stomachache, sitting in a waiting room, and yet something in the air had shifted, and my whole body seemed to know it before my mind caught up. I waited perhaps 10 minutes, though it felt considerably longer, watching other patients called back for their own appointments, watching the muted television flicker through its morning segments, watching the rain against the windows grow slightly heavier. When the receptionist finally returned, she was not alone. A man in a gray cardigan walked beside her, his expression carefully neutral in the particular way of people trained to deliver news they know will not be welcome. And he introduced himself to me as a case coordinator, not a doctor, and asked whether I would be willing to step into a private room to discuss my file before we proceeded with today's appointment. I said yes, though everything in me wanted to say no, wanted to simply walk back out into the rain and drive away and never think about that clinic again. But some old habit of politeness, or perhaps simple confusion, kept me seated and compliant, and I followed him down a hallway I did not recognize, into a small windowless room furnished with nothing but a table and 3 chairs, the kind of room I have since learned is specifically designed for delivering difficult news, stripped of anything that might distract from the conversation at hand. He sat across from me and folded his hands on the table, and for a moment he simply looked at me, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that he had kind eyes, that whatever was coming was not going to be delivered cruelly, even if it was going to be delivered painfully. And then he told me that my file had been flagged 7 years earlier, during my appendix surgery, and that flag had never been formally cleared. I asked him what that meant, my voice sounding strange to my own ears, thinner than I intended. He explained carefully, in the practiced, gentle tone of someone accustomed to delivering unpleasant procedural information, that a note had been entered into my chart following an evaluation conducted during my hospital stay at 17. The note, he said, expressed concern about my home environment, referenced my community of origin specifically, and recommended that any future visit I made to any clinic within their healthcare network should trigger an additional review process before treatment could proceed, in case there remained ongoing concerns about my safety that needed to be addressed by a social worker before medical care continued. I sat there and felt the blood drain slowly from my face, the way you might feel the temperature drop before a storm arrives. 7 years. 7 years that note had been sitting in a file with my name attached to it, unresolved and untouched, like a trap set and forgotten, waiting patiently for the day I would walk back through those doors, a day that note's author could not possibly have anticipated, since surely if she had thought about it at all, she would have assumed I would live out my entire life within the community she had flagged as a concern. I asked him, my voice shaking more than I wanted it to, what exactly had been written all those years ago. He hesitated for a moment, some flicker of professional caution crossing his face, and then he turned his laptop screen toward me, briefly, long enough for me to catch fragments of text before he turned it back around to face himself. I will tell you honestly that my hands were trembling too badly in that moment to read every word, but certain phrases burned themselves into my memory with a kind of permanence I have never been able to shake. Words like restricted community, limited outside contact, possible undisclosed labor concerns. Family declined to elaborate on discipline practices. I sat with those words for a long moment, feeling something crack open in my chest. My mother's exhausted, frightened hesitation in that waiting room 7 years earlier, a mother terrified for her 17-year-old daughter's life, unfamiliar with English paperwork and unable to read cursive quickly under pressure, had been recorded apparently as evasiveness. My own honest answers, given in good faith to a stranger's questions while groggy from anesthesia, describing chores that every child on every farm I had ever known performed as simply part of a shared family life, had been translated through a lens of unfamiliarity and suspicion into language suggesting possible child labor. My entire community, the world that had raised me with more love and care than that clipboard could ever have understood, had been reduced to a checklist of red flags by someone who had spent perhaps 20 minutes with my family, someone who had never once followed up, never sent a caseworker to our farm, never asked a single further question in 7 years, but who had nonetheless left behind a permanent mark that would resurface the moment I walked back through those doors as a grown woman building an entirely independent life. I asked the case coordinator, once I trusted my voice enough to speak, what would happen now, at 24, living entirely on my own, working my own job, paying my own rent. He told me, not unkindly, that because I was now an independent adult, the original concern was, in his words, likely moot, but that procedure required a formal review process before the flag could be officially removed from my record, and that this review would take some time to complete. In the meantime, he said, I could still receive care for my current visit, but a social worker would need to be present in the room during my examination, as a matter of required protocol. I remember asking him, with a kind of disbelief I could not entirely hide, what would happen if I simply refused to allow a social worker into the room. He explained, gently but with the immovable firmness of someone reciting policy rather than personal opinion, that the flag would remain permanently active on my file if I refused, and that any future visit to any clinic within their network would trigger this same review process indefinitely, for the rest of my life, unless I cooperated with today's process as the first step toward having it formally cleared. I sat in that windowless room and felt something harden inside me, a kind of resolve I did not entirely recognize in myself. I was 24 years old. I paid my own rent above a hardware store 2 doors down from the bakery where I had learned to build an entirely new life. I worked 6 days a week, my hands in dough before the sun rose each morning, exactly as they had once been in the milking barn of my childhood, except now every choice involved in that labor was entirely my own. I had left my family, my faith community, my whole familiar world, at enormous personal cost. Precisely so that I could become a person who made her own decisions about her own life. And here I was being told that a stranger needed to sit in the corner of an examination room while a doctor looked at my stomach, all because of a note written when I was a frightened, groggy 17-year-old girl who had simply grown up milking cows before school. I agreed to the social worker's presence that day because I did not feel I had any real choice, sitting there in that small room with my stomach still aching and my mind reeling from what I had just learned. I remember lying back on that examination table, the paper covering crinkling beneath me in a way that suddenly felt unbearably loud in the silence of the room, acutely aware of the social worker's presence behind me, close enough that I could hear the soft scratch of her pen against her notepad every time the doctor asked me a question, every time I answered. I found myself, absurdly, choosing my words more carefully than I ever had in any previous medical appointment, second-guessing even simple descriptions of my symptoms, wondering whether an ordinary complaint about stress at work might somehow be twisted, the way my honest words at 17 had once been twisted, into something that would only extend the very scrutiny I was desperate to escape. I sat through the examination that followed with a stranger positioned quietly in the corner, taking notes on a small pad, while a doctor examined me and eventually diagnosed what turned out to be a stress-related ulcer, brought on, I am quite certain now, in no small part by the stress of the very appointment I was sitting through in that moment. The social worker asked me questions afterward, gentle enough in her manner, about my current life, my independence, my safety, my relationships. I answered every question honestly, the way I had been raised to do, and I do not believe she was a cruel or careless person. I think she was simply doing a job within a system that had already, 7 years earlier, made up its mind about who I was and where I came from, long before she ever walked into that room to meet the actual woman sitting in front of her. I want to tell you what happened after that first appointment, because the story does not end there, not by a long way, and I think the part that came next taught me even more than the appointment itself. I drove home that afternoon in a kind of daze, the windshield wipers beating a slow rhythm against the rain, my mind circling the same handful of words over and over: restricted community, undisclosed labor concerns. I did not go back to the bakery that day, though I had told Denise I would stop by after my appointment. I called her instead from my apartment, my voice unsteady, and told her some of what had happened, though not all of it, because I was still trying to understand it myself. She came over that evening anyway, letting herself in with the spare key I had given her months before, and she found me sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in front of me, a folder of paperwork the case coordinator had given me spread out across the surface. She sat down across from me without a word at first, simply reading through the pages I had already gone through twice, her face growing harder and more focused the further she read. When she finally looked up at me, she asked me a single question. She asked me whether I wanted to fight it, or whether I wanted to simply let it lie and hope it never caused trouble again. I remember sitting with that question for a long moment, feeling the exhaustion of the day pressing down on me, the temptation to simply let it go, to avoid the fight, to tell myself that as long as I did not need major medical care again anytime soon, it would not matter. But something in me, some stubborn thread that I think had been growing since that night on the porch when I first questioned my whole life at 20 years old, would not let me choose the easier path. I told her I wanted to fight it. She nodded, as though she had expected nothing less, and she reached for a pen and a fresh sheet of paper and told me we would start making a list, right then and there, of everything we would need to do. The first call I made was the following morning, standing in the alley behind the bakery ovens during my 15-minute break, my apron still dusted with flour, my phone pressed hard against my ear to block out the sound of the delivery trucks idling on the street. I called the number printed at the bottom of the paperwork, a general patient services line, and I was transferred, after a long hold spent listening to the same 8 bars of instrumental music looping over and over, to someone in what they called records compliance. The woman I spoke with was polite but distant, the kind of polite that comes from reciting the same explanations dozens of times a day to dozens of frustrated callers. She told me that flags of this nature required what she called a multi-step verification process, involving review by the original department that had entered the note, confirmation of my current living situation and independence, and a final sign-off from a supervising case manager before any change could be made to my permanent file. She told me this process typically took between 8 and 12 weeks, though it could take longer depending on staffing and caseload. I asked her, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice, why a note written when I was a groggy 17-year-old should require 12 weeks to remove now that I was a 24-year-old woman with her own apartment, her own job, and her own bank account. She told me, not unkindly but with a kind of practiced detachment, that she understood my frustration, but that the process existed to protect vulnerable individuals, and that it could not be shortened simply because I found it inconvenient. I hung up that first call feeling more discouraged than I had felt walking out of the clinic the day before, and I remember standing in that alley for a long moment afterward, staring at the brick wall opposite me, wondering whether this fight was one I truly had the strength for. Denise found me there when she came out to check on why my break had run long, and I told her what the woman on the phone had said, and she was quiet for a moment before she said something I have carried with me ever since. She told me that systems like this one are built to wear people down, not through cruelty exactly, but through sheer administrative friction. The assumption being that most people will eventually give up simply because the fight costs more energy than most people have to spare. She told me the way to beat a system like that was not through anger, which only exhausts you faster, but through a kind of patient, documented persistence, a paper trail so thorough and so calm that no one along the chain could dismiss me without real justification. I took her advice seriously. I bought a plain notebook from the hardware store below my apartment, the same kind my father used to use to track feed purchases on the farm, and I began writing down every single call I made, the date, the time, the name of the person I spoke with when they gave it, and a short summary of what was said. I kept every piece of paperwork in a folder that grew steadily thicker over the following weeks. I began sending short, polite follow-up emails after every phone call, restating what had been discussed, so that there would always be a written record beyond whatever notes the person on the other end of the line might or might not have taken. The second call, made about a week later, connected me with a supervisor named Mr. Alvarez, who was, in fairness to him, considerably more helpful than the first woman had been. He listened to my full explanation without interrupting, asked several clarifying questions about my current living situation, and told me he would personally flag my case, if I would forgive the unfortunate choice of words, for expedited review given the clear evidence of my independence. I remember feeling, after that call, a small flicker of hope, the first genuine hope I had felt since walking out of that windowless room a week before. That hope was tempered somewhat 2 weeks later, when I received a letter in the mail, official and formal in its language, informing me that my case had been reviewed and that, due to insufficient documentation of my independent living status, the flag would remain in place pending submission of additional evidence, including but not limited to proof of residence, proof of employment, and a signed statement from a current employer attesting to my character and circumstances. I remember reading that letter standing at my own kitchen counter and feeling a fresh wave of frustration wash over me, not because the request itself was unreasonable, but because no one had told me, during either of my previous 2 calls, that this documentation would be required. I had to wonder how many other people, faced with a similarly vague and shifting set of requirements, simply gave up at this stage, worn down exactly as Denise had predicted. I did not give up. I gathered every piece of documentation the letter requested. I brought my lease agreement, signed and notarized, to a copy shop and made duplicates. I asked Denise to write the letter of character reference she had already offered weeks before, and she wrote it that same evening, sitting at my kitchen table again, her handwriting neat and careful on the bakery's letterhead, describing my punctuality, my work ethic, my growing skill at the register and in the kitchen, and, in a line that made my throat tighten when I first read it, her genuine pride in watching me build an independent life for myself over the past 2 years. I found a notary public 3 towns over, the nearest one I could locate who had appointment availability within the week, and I took an unpaid half-day from the bakery to drive there and have my documents properly certified. I mailed everything back to the address on the letter, along with a cover letter of my own, calm and factual in tone, summarizing my situation clearly and requesting a specific timeline for the next stage of review. Then I waited. Those weeks of waiting were, in some ways, harder than any of the phone calls or paperwork had been, because waiting gives the mind too much room to imagine every possible outcome, and I spent many evenings during that period lying awake, running through scenarios in which the flag remained permanently in place, in which every future doctor's visit for the rest of my life would require a stranger sitting in the corner of the room, taking notes on my character, in which I would never truly be free of a mistake made when I was 17 years old and could not have known enough to defend myself. About 5 weeks after I had mailed my documentation, I received a call, not a letter this time, from a woman named Patricia, who identified herself as a senior case reviewer. Her tone was warmer than anyone else's I had spoken with throughout the process, and she told me she had personally reviewed my file, including the additional documentation I had submitted, and that she found the original concern to be, in her professional assessment, no longer applicable given my current circumstances. She told me, however, that full clearance still required one final in-person meeting, a formality, she assured me, but a required one, during which I would need to answer a short series of questions in person before the flag could be officially and permanently removed from my file. I want to tell you about one particular week during that process, somewhere around the 8th or 9th week, because it was the week I came closest to giving up entirely, and I think it is important to include the moments of near defeat alongside the eventual victory, since I know some of you listening may be in the middle of your own difficult fight right now, and I do not want to give you a version of this story that skips over how genuinely hard it was to keep going. That week began with a call to a new department entirely, one I had not previously spoken with, because Patricia's initial review, though warm and encouraging, had apparently required what she called a cross-departmental sign-off from someone in the clinic's original records division, the same division, as it happened, where Linda Kowalski had once worked. I called the number I was given and was placed on hold for nearly 40 minutes, standing in that same alley behind the bakery ovens, my apron growing damp with the light rain that had begun to fall, until a man finally answered and informed me, after I had explained my situation in full for what felt like the 100th time, that he had no record of my case in his queue at all, that whatever had been sent to his department must have been lost or misdirected somewhere in the transfer, and that I would need to have Patricia resubmit the request before he could proceed. I remember standing in that alley after hanging up, the rain soaking through my apron, feeling something in me that had held steady for 8 full weeks finally begin to crack. I remember thinking, with a clarity that frightened me, that perhaps this was simply how it was meant to go, that perhaps the system was built precisely to grind down people like me until we simply stopped calling, stopped writing, stopped believing the fight was winnable, and I remember standing there seriously considering, for the first time since this whole process began, whether I had the strength left to continue. It was Denise, again, who pulled me back from that edge. I came inside from the alley that afternoon with my eyes red-rimmed, and she took one look at me and set down the tray of rolls she had been carrying, and simply held me for a long moment in the middle of the kitchen, flour dust settling on both our shoulders, before she asked me what had happened. When I told her, she did not offer easy reassurance, did not tell me it would surely work out fine in the end, because I think she respected me too much to offer comfort she could not actually guarantee. Instead, she asked me a single practical question. She asked me whether I had gotten the name of the man I had just spoken with, and when I told her, sheepishly, that I had not thought to ask, she told me gently but firmly that this was the single most important habit I needed to build if I intended to keep fighting this, because a system without names attached to its failures could deflect responsibility indefinitely, but a system forced to reckon with specific named individuals and specific documented failures had a much harder time hiding behind vague procedural language. From that day forward, I made it an absolute rule, no matter how tired or discouraged I felt, to get a full name, and where possible a direct extension, from every single person I spoke with, and to note, in my notebook, not only what they told me, but any discrepancy between what they told me and what I had previously been told by someone else. This turned out to matter enormously. When I called Patricia the following morning and explained that my case appeared to have been lost in transfer to the records division, and gave her the specific name and extension of the man I had spoken with, along with the exact date and time of our conversation, I watched, over the course of that single phone call, her tone shift from polite concern to something closer to genuine frustration on my behalf, directed not at me, but at whatever internal failure had caused the delay. She told me she would personally track down where the request had gone missing and would call me back within 2 days with an update. She did call back, precisely as promised, and informed me that the request had indeed been lost somewhere in an internal transfer, an error she described, with evident irritation, as unfortunately common given how many different systems and departments a single case had to pass through. She resubmitted it herself, this time copying herself directly on every subsequent communication to ensure nothing would go missing again. And it was this intervention, I believe, more than any other single action I took during those 13 weeks, that finally moved my case toward its resolution. I share this particular week with you, not because it reflects well on me, since I came closer to quitting during those few days than at any other point in the process, but because I think it reflects something true and important about fighting a bureaucratic system of this kind. The system does not always resist you through deliberate cruelty. Often it resists you simply through carelessness, through the sheer number of hands a single piece of paperwork must pass through, any one of which might set it down, forget it, misplace it, without any particular malice at all. Persistence, in the face of that kind of resistance, is not really about outsmarting an enemy. It is about simply refusing to disappear, refusing to become one more piece of paperwork quietly lost in a drawer, insisting, call after call, name after name, that you remain visible until someone with the authority to act finally does so. That final meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning, nearly 11 weeks after my original appointment, and I remember driving to a different office building this time. Not the clinic itself, but an administrative office located above a pharmacy on the other side of town, my folder of documentation sitting on the passenger seat beside me like a kind of talisman I had come to rely on. Patricia met me in person exactly as warm and professional as she had sounded on the phone, and the meeting itself, though it required me to once again answer many of the same questions I had already answered twice before, felt different in tone from everything that had come before it. She asked about my work, my apartment, my relationships, my sense of safety and autonomy in my current life, and she listened to my answers with what felt like genuine attention rather than rote procedure. Near the end of the meeting, she told me something that stayed with me long afterward. She said that in her years doing this work, she had seen files like mine more often than people might expect. Notes entered with good intentions but insufficient cultural understanding. Flags that lingered for years simply because no one along the chain had the authority, the time, or the inclination to question a decision someone else had made before them. She told me she was glad I had persisted, because many people faced with the same obstacles I had faced simply did not. 2 weeks after that meeting, nearly 13 weeks in total from the day I first walked back into that clinic, I received a final letter, this one considerably shorter than any of the others, informing me that the flag on my file had been formally and permanently removed, effective immediately, and that no further review would be required for any future visit to any facility within their network. I remember sitting with that letter in my hands for a long time, reading it over and over, waiting to feel the triumphant relief I had imagined I would feel when this day finally arrived. What I felt instead was quieter than triumph, something closer to exhaustion, mixed with a kind of hard-won pride, the particular satisfaction of having done something difficult and necessary entirely through my own persistence, without giving up, without losing my temper in a way that might have undermined my case, without ever once backing down from what I knew to be true about myself and about my family. I called Denise first, of course, and she came over that same evening with a small cake from the bakery, not one of our usual sale items, but something she had made specially. And we sat at my kitchen table and ate cake and did not talk very much at all, simply sitting together in the particular comfortable silence that only grows between people who have been through something difficult side by side. I want to tell you about one more thing that happened during those 13 weeks, because I think it belongs in this story too, even though it is a smaller moment than the calls and the letters and the final meeting. About halfway through the process, frustrated and discouraged after receiving that first letter demanding additional documentation, I drove out to my parents' farm on a Sunday afternoon, something I had not done in several months. I sat with my mother in her kitchen, the same kitchen where she had once held me against her apron and told me we needed to see an English doctor, and I told her for the first time the whole story of what had happened at the clinic, both when I was 17 and now at 24. I watched her face as I explained what had been written about our family all those years ago, the words evasiveness and undisclosed labor concerns, and I watched something in her expression shift from confusion to a kind of quiet, controlled anger I had rarely seen in her before. She told me, once I had finished, that she remembered that day with perfect clarity, remembered sitting alone in that waiting room for 4 hours, terrified for my life, unable to call anyone, surrounded by strangers who looked at her the way people had always looked at us in town. She told me she had answered every question the staff asked her as honestly and fully as her limited English and her exhaustion allowed, and that it had never once occurred to her that her fear and unfamiliarity might be recorded as suspicious behavior, rather than simply as the fear and unfamiliarity they truly were. We sat together in that kitchen for a long time that afternoon, and though my mother did not fully understand every detail of the bureaucratic process I was fighting through, 13 weeks of phone calls and documentation being a world quite foreign to her own way of life, she understood the injustice of it completely, in the way that any mother understands an injustice done to her child, regardless of the particular language it is dressed in. Before I left that evening, she took both my hands in hers, the way she used to do when I was small and frightened of a thunderstorm, and she told me she was proud of me for fighting it, proud in a way that surprised me, given how much pain my leaving had caused her. My father was out in the barn when I arrived that afternoon, and it was only as I was preparing to leave, my hand already on the door of my car, that he came around the side of the house, his boots heavy with the day's work, and asked, in his quiet way, whether I had a few minutes before driving back. We stood together near the fence line where the pasture met the yard, a place I remembered from 1,000 childhood evenings, and I told him a shorter version of what I had already told my mother, watching his face carefully, since my father had always been harder to read than she was, his emotions kept close and rarely spoken aloud. He listened without interrupting, the way he always had, and when I finished he was quiet for a long moment, looking out over the pasture rather than at me. Then he told me something I did not expect. He told me that he too remembered that day at the clinic with more clarity than he had ever let on, remembered pacing the fields long after my mother and I had left for town, unable to concentrate on his work, praying in a way he rarely allowed himself to do openly. He told me he had always carried a quiet guilt about not being there in that waiting room himself, about leaving my mother to face all of it alone. And hearing now what that day had ultimately cost me 7 years later seemed to deepen that guilt rather than ease it. I told him, as gently as I could, that none of what happened was his fault, that he could not have known, that no one could have known, what a single afternoon's notes might turn into so many years later. He nodded slowly, still looking out at the pasture, and then he said something I have carried with me ever since, something so unlike his usual careful reticence that it startled me. He said that he did not always understand the choices I had made, leaving the community, leaving the faith he still held to so firmly, but that he had never once doubted, not for a single day, that I had been raised in a home built on love, and that whatever a stranger's clipboard had once suggested otherwise was simply, plainly wrong. He said it with a kind of quiet finality that told me he had been carrying this conviction for some time, perhaps since the day I first left, waiting for an opportunity to say it aloud. I drove back to town that evening with tears running freely down my face, grateful tears this time, not the grieving kind I had shed so often during my first year away, and I remember calling Denise the moment I arrived home simply to tell her what my father had said, needing to share it with someone who would understand how much those words meant coming from a man who so rarely spoke of his feelings at all. I want to tell you a little more about Ruth, too, and the particular story she shared with me that evening. We first discovered how similar our experiences had been, because I think it deserves more than the brief summary I gave you earlier. Ruth's flag, unlike my own, had never been formally connected to any single dramatic incident in her mind until she began piecing it together herself, months into her own fight to clear it. She told me that as a 14-year-old with a broken arm, badly set after a fall from a hayloft, she had been kept overnight for observation, and during that overnight stay, a well-meaning but unfamiliar young resident had asked her a long series of questions about her home life. Questions Ruth, exhausted and in pain, had answered as briefly as possible, assuming brevity was simply good manners rather than something that might later be read as reluctance or concealment. She told me that when she finally saw her own file, years later, she found language describing her answers as guarded, and her family as uncooperative with follow-up questioning. when in truth, she insisted to me with a kind of exhausted disbelief. Even years removed from the event, her family had never once been told that any follow-up questioning had been expected or requested at all. No one had called. No letter had ever arrived. The follow-up her family was accused of avoiding had simply never been attempted, and yet the accusation of their evasiveness had remained, unchallenged, in her permanent record for years. Hearing this detail from Ruth changed something in how I understood my own situation. It was not only that individual notes could be misread through unfamiliarity, as had happened with Linda Kowalski and my own mother's frightened hesitation. It was that the entire follow-up system meant to verify or dismiss such concerns seemed, in both our cases and likely in many others we would never hear about, to simply fail to function as intended, leaving the original suspicion standing by default, not because anyone had actively confirmed it, but because no one had ever bothered, or perhaps even been required, to check. Ruth and I spent a long time that evening simply sitting with this realization together. Two women who had built entirely separate lives in entirely separate towns, discovering that the particular wound each of us carried, which had each felt so achingly personal and specific, was in fact something closer to a pattern, a gap in a system large enough to swallow both our stories and, we had to assume, many others we would never have the chance to hear. That visit did something for our relationship that I do not think either of us fully expected. It became, in its own quiet way, a kind of bridge between the two halves of my life, the world I had been born into and the world I had built for myself, meeting for a moment in that kitchen over a shared understanding of an injustice that neither of us had chosen, but both of us had lived through in our own different ways. I have thought many times since about how differently this story might have ended if I had not had people like Denise, and eventually my own mother standing beside me through those 13 weeks. I think about young women, and young men too, who go through similar experiences entirely alone, without a Denise to write a character letter, without the language or the confidence to navigate call after call with case reviewers and supervisors, without a mother willing, even after years of painful distance, to sit in a kitchen and say, simply, "I am proud of you for fighting this." I think of how many flags must remain permanently in place, not because they are accurate, but because the person they describe never had the resources or the support to challenge them. There is another part of this story I have not yet told you, and I think it belongs here, somewhere in the middle of those 13 weeks, because it changed the way I understood everything that had happened to me. About 7 weeks into the process, frustrated by the slow crawl of phone calls and letters, I found myself unable to simply wait passively for the system to move at its own pace. I am not a woman who has ever been comfortable with waiting when there was something more I could do, a trait my mother always said I inherited from my father, who could never sit still through a rain delay without finding some small chore to occupy his hands. So one evening, after closing up the bakery, I sat down at my kitchen table with my notebook and my folder of documentation, and I decided I wanted to understand, if I could, who exactly had written that original note about my family, and why. I did not expect to find much. 7 years is a long time, and I assumed the nurse who had sat beside my hospital bed with her clipboard had likely moved on from that clinic entirely, perhaps even out of the profession altogether. But during one of my calls with Mr. Alvarez, the supervisor who had first offered to expedite my case, I asked him, somewhat impulsively, whether it would be possible to know the name of the person who had originally entered the note into my file. I expected him to refuse, citing privacy policies of the sort that seemed to govern every other aspect of this process. But to my surprise, he told me that while he could not share her personnel information, he could confirm that the note had been entered by a nurse named Linda Kowalski, who had, in fact, retired from the clinic almost 3 years earlier. I do not fully know what I intended to do with that name once I had it. Some part of me, I think, wanted simply to understand her, to put a fuller picture to the person who had shaped so much of my recent life without ever knowing my name beyond a chart number. Another part of me, I will admit honestly, wanted something closer to a confrontation, some opportunity to make her understand what her 20 minutes of clipboard notes had cost me. I found her through the kind of small-town persistence that comes naturally once you have lived in a place long enough to understand how word travels. Denise, it turned out, knew a woman who had once worked alongside a nurse named Linda at that very clinic, and through her, and a few careful roundabout conversations, I learned that Linda Kowalski now lived in a small house on the outskirts of town, not more than 15 minutes from my own apartment, and that she volunteered on Wednesday afternoons at a food pantry attached to one of the local churches. I want to tell you honestly that I debated for nearly a full week whether I should go there at all. I wrote her a letter 3 separate times and tore each one up before finishing it, unable to find the right balance between the anger I still carried and the strange, unexpected curiosity I felt about who this woman actually was. In the end, it was not a letter I sent, but myself, on a Wednesday afternoon, standing outside that food pantry with my hands shoved deep in my coat pockets, watching through the window as an older woman with graying hair sorted canned goods into neat rows on a folding table. I recognized her the moment she looked up, though I could not tell you exactly how, since I had certainly never seen her face clearly during the 2 days I spent in that hospital bed at 17, groggy and unfocused from anesthesia. But something about the particular efficient way she moved, sorting cans with the same brisk competence I remembered vaguely from the vitals checks and IV adjustments of that hospital stay, told me this was the woman I had been looking for. I introduced myself, and I watched her face carefully as I gave her my name, waiting to see whether it would mean anything to her. For a long moment it clearly did not, and I felt a strange, unexpected disappointment at that, as though some part of me had wanted my case to have weighed on her mind the way it had weighed on mine. But then I mentioned the year, and the appendix surgery, and I watched something shift behind her eyes, a slow, dawning recognition that made her set down the can of green beans she had been holding. She asked me to sit with her for a few minutes, gesturing to 2 folding chairs near the pantry's small break area, and I did, my heart pounding in a way that surprised me, given how carefully I had rehearsed this moment in my mind over the preceding week. I told her, as calmly as I could manage, what had happened. I told her about the flag, about the words restricted community and undisclosed labor concerns, about the 13 weeks at that point still ongoing, of phone calls and documentation I had been fighting through simply to have those words removed from my file. I watched her face as I spoke, and I want to tell you honestly that what I saw there was not defensiveness, not the irritation I had half expected, but something closer to genuine distress, the particular distress of a person confronting a consequence of their own actions they had never imagined, and certainly never intended. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished, turning her hands over in her lap, and then she told me something I did not expect to hear. She told me that in her final years at the clinic, she had grown increasingly uneasy about exactly this kind of situation, though she had never known, until this moment, that one of her own notes had caused this particular harm. She explained that during her training, many years earlier, she had received almost no education about Amish or Plain communities specifically, beyond a vague general awareness that such communities existed and sometimes presented unique challenges for medical staff. She told me that in the absence of real understanding, fear and unfamiliarity had often filled the gap, and that fear, dressed up in the careful clinical language of a chart note, could look very much like professional diligence even when it was, at its root, simply ignorance given a badge of authority. She told me she remembered vaguely now the general shape of that day, though not the specific details of my case among the many hundreds of patients she had seen over her career. She remembered my mother's fear in that waiting room, though she had not at the time recognized it as fear rather than evasiveness. She told me, with what seemed to be genuine remorse, that she had believed in that moment she was protecting a young girl who might not have had a voice of her own, and that it had simply never occurred to her that the very act of writing that note, without any real evidence, without any follow-up investigation, without any attempt to actually understand the community she was flagging, might itself become its own kind of harm, one that could follow a person for years, entirely outside her awareness or control. I asked her, because I needed to know, whether she believed my family had been in any real danger, whether she believed, looking back now with the fuller context I had just given her, that her original concern had been justified. She was quiet again for a long moment, and then she told me, honestly, that she did not know, that she had never known, that she had made a judgment in 20 minutes based on limited information and her own unexamined assumptions, and that the honest truth was she should never have had the power to attach a permanent, indefinite flag to a person's medical file based on so little. I did not leave that conversation feeling the triumphant vindication I might have imagined feeling a week earlier when I first set out to find her. What I felt instead was something more complicated, a kind of sad clarity. I understood, sitting in that folding chair beside her, that she was not a villain in any simple sense, not a cruel woman who had set out to harm my family. She was, instead, a symptom of something larger, a system that had given her the authority to make permanent judgments about people she barely understood, without requiring her to verify those judgments, without building in any mechanism to revisit them, without ever considering what it might mean for a note like that to sit, unexamined, for 7 years, waiting for a day neither of us could have predicted. Before I left, she asked me, her voice unsteady in a way that told me the conversation had cost her something too, whether there was anything she could do now, at this late stage, to help undo the harm that had been done. I told her, honestly, that I did not know, that the process I was going through operated through official channels she likely had no more influence over now than I did, since she was retired. But I asked her whether she would be willing to write a letter, a personal statement acknowledging the limitations of her original assessment, that I could include in my documentation. She agreed immediately, and 2 days later I received an envelope in the mail, her handwriting careful and a little shaky, a letter in which she described, in her own words, the circumstances of that original note, her limited understanding at the time, and her genuine belief now that the flag should be removed given everything she had since learned about the family and the community she had once judged too quickly. I do not know whether that letter made any real difference in the official process. Patricia, when I eventually mentioned it to her during our final in-person meeting, told me it had been added to my file as supplementary documentation, though she could not say for certain how much weight it carried against the existing procedural requirements. But it mattered to me, deeply, in a way separate from its bureaucratic usefulness. It mattered because it meant the woman who had written those original words now understood, at least in part, what those words had cost. And it meant I had faced the source of my 7 years of hidden suspicion directly, rather than only fighting against the faceless system that had carried her judgment forward long after she herself had likely forgotten writing it. I think about Linda Kowalski sometimes still, sorting cans of green beans in that small church pantry, carrying her own quiet burden of unexamined judgments made across a long career, judgments she will likely never fully know the consequences of, except in the rare case, like mine, where the person she judged found her way back to sit across from her and ask her to understand. There is one more thread to this story I want to share with you, because it broadened my understanding of what had happened to me beyond my own individual experience. And I think it matters for anyone listening who might wonder whether my situation was simply an unusual, isolated mistake. About 9 weeks into the process, I mentioned what I was going through to a woman named Ruth, someone I had grown close to through the bakery, who had grown up in a different but related plain community about 60 miles from my own, and had left several years before I did, under somewhat similar circumstances. I had known, vaguely, that Ruth shared a piece of my background, but we had never discussed it in much depth before that conversation, both of us, I think, more focused on our present lives than on excavating our respective pasts. When I told her about the flag, about the language in my file, about the 13 weeks of calls and letters, she went very quiet, and then she told me something that genuinely shocked me. She told me she had experienced almost the exact same thing, 3 years earlier, at a different clinic in a different town, following a childhood hospitalization for a broken arm at age 14. Her file, too, had been flagged, her family's answers during that hospitalization similarly misread through a lens of unfamiliarity and suspicion, and she, too, had discovered the flag only years later, as an adult, when she sought treatment at a walk-in clinic for a minor injury and found herself sitting through an unexpected review process disturbingly similar to my own. We sat together that evening, comparing notes in a way that felt both validating and deeply unsettling. Validating, because it meant I was not alone, that this was not simply a strange, isolated mistake unique to my own file, but something closer to a pattern, a systemic gap in how certain clinics and hospital systems understood and documented interactions with plain communities. Unsettling, for exactly that same reason, because it meant there were very likely many more files out there belonging to people we would never meet, carrying similar flags, similar unexamined suspicions, waiting in the dark for their own unpredictable days of discovery. Ruth told me she had eventually succeeded in clearing her own flag, though her process had taken even longer than mine, nearly 5 months from start to finish, partly because she had navigated it entirely alone, without a Denise to write letters or drive her to appointments, without a mother she felt she could return to for support given the more painful circumstances of her own leaving. Hearing her story made me feel, in equal measure, gratitude for the support I had been fortunate enough to have, and a kind of quiet grief for everyone like Ruth who had to fight the same battle with far fewer resources at their disposal. Ruth and I talked, in the weeks that followed, about whether there was anything more we could do, beyond simply clearing our own individual files, to address what seemed to be a larger pattern. We did not have the resources or the standing to change hospital policy on our own, 2 young women working in a small-town bakery, but we did write a joint letter, once both of our flags had finally been cleared, addressed to the clinic's patient advocacy office, describing both of our experiences and suggesting, as respectfully and constructively as we could, that staff working with plain communities might benefit from additional cultural training, and that any flag of this nature should include a mandatory review period, rather than being allowed to sit indefinitely, unexamined, for years at a time. I do not know whether that letter changed anything within the clinic's actual policies. We received a polite, generic reply thanking us for our feedback, the kind of response that gave little indication of whether it had been read closely or simply filed away alongside 1,000 other complaints and suggestions. But writing it mattered to both of us, I think, as a way of trying to turn our own difficult experiences into something that might, in some small way, spare someone else the same 7 years, or 5 months, or 13 weeks, of carrying a hidden judgment they never knew existed. I want to close this story now, though I could tell you many more small details from those 13 weeks if you wanted to hear them, because I think the heart of what I have to share with you has already been said. Systems remember things about us. Sometimes what they remember is accurate and important and protects people who genuinely need protecting. But sometimes what they remember is a single tired stranger's snap judgment, calcified into permanent language on a permanent record, waiting patiently in the dark for a day that person could not have anticipated, a day when the person they misjudged walks back through the door, older now, different now, but still carrying, unknowingly, the weight of a mistake that was never truly theirs to carry. I still return to that same clinic today from time to time, when circumstances require it, and I feel, each time I walk through those doors, a small, stubborn satisfaction that I have earned through 13 weeks of phone calls and paperwork, and one difficult healing conversation in my mother's kitchen. My file is clean now. Whatever appears on a screen when a receptionist types in my name is simply the truth of who I am today, nothing more and nothing less. A woman who built her own life with her own 2 hands, according to her own choices, answerable, at long last, to no one's outdated suspicions. I still bake, all these years later, though I have since moved on from Denise's shop to a small place of my own, a dream I could not have imagined for myself back when I was that frightened 17-year-old girl in the buggy, doubled over in pain, unable to picture any life beyond the one I had been born into. I still drive that car I was once so afraid of, though I have long since traded it for a newer one, and I no longer grip the door handle with white knuckles the way I did on that very first ride with Karen so many years ago. I visit my mother regularly now, our relationship rebuilt slowly, conversation by conversation, cake by cake, in a way I once feared might never be possible after the way I left. I want to tell you a little about that small bakery of my own, because I think it belongs at the end of this story, as a kind of proof that the 13 weeks I spent fighting a flag on a piece of paper did not define the years that came after them, even though they certainly shaped me. It took me almost 6 more years after that final letter arrived to save enough, and to learn enough, to open a shop of my own. Denise, characteristically generous, helped me in every way she could, teaching me not only the baking itself, which I had largely mastered by then, but the far less romantic details of running a small business, the ordering and the bookkeeping and the endless small decisions that go into keeping the lights on and the ovens running. I named the shop after my grandmother, a woman I barely remembered from my earliest childhood, but whose bread recipe I had carried with me out of that old life and into this new one, a small thread connecting the 2 halves of who I had become. I remember the day I chose the name for the shop, sitting at my kitchen table with a list of possibilities scratched out and reconsidered a dozen times over, before I finally settled on my grandmother's name, a woman I had known only through a handful of hazy early childhood memories, and the recipe cards I had carried out of my parents' house in that single-packed bag on the night I left. I liked the idea that her name, a name rooted so firmly in the old life, would now hang above the door of a shop built entirely within the new one, a small, quiet bridge between the two halves of my life that I had once feared could never truly be reconciled. The shop is modest, nothing grand, a single storefront on a quiet street with a bell over the door and a case of pastries that changes with the seasons. But it is mine, entirely mine, in a way that still occasionally strikes me with a kind of quiet disbelief when I unlock the door each morning before dawn, much as I once unlocked the barn door on my parents' farm, except now every choice involved is my own, made freely, answerable to no one but myself and the customers I hope to please. Over the years since opening that shop, I have come to know, through the particular grapevine that seems to exist among people who have left plain communities, a surprising number of young women and men navigating experiences similar to my own. Some come to me directly, having heard through mutual acquaintances that I once fought a flag like theirs and won. I do not think of myself as any kind of expert, and I am always careful to tell them that my experience was my own, shaped by circumstances they may or may not share, that Denise's generosity and my mother's eventual willingness to reconcile were not guarantees I can offer anyone else. But I do try to share what I learned, the value of a notebook and a paper trail, the importance of patient, documented persistence over anger, the possibility, however slim, that even a stranger who once wrote something painful about you might, years later, be willing to understand what that note cost you if you find the courage to ask them. I think of one young woman in particular who came to me perhaps 4 years ago, barely 20, freshly arrived in town after leaving a community not far from my own, discovering much as I had that a flag had followed her from a childhood hospitalization she barely remembered. I sat with her in my own shop, long after closing, sharing what I had learned, and I watched her face move through the same stages I remembered moving through myself, the disbelief, the anger, the exhaustion, and eventually, months later when she returned to tell me her own flag had finally been cleared, something closer to the quiet, hard-won pride I had felt reading that final letter in my own kitchen so many years before. I do not know how many more young women and men are out there right now, sitting in windowless rooms of their own, learning for the first time about notes written when they were children, unable to defend themselves against words chosen by strangers who meant, in most cases I have come to believe, no true malice, but who nonetheless left behind consequences that would ripple forward for years. I cannot fix that larger problem alone, no more than Ruth and I could single-handedly change hospital policy with our one joint letter all those years ago. But I can keep the door of my little shop open to whoever finds their way to it, carrying whatever version of my own story they happen to be living through, and I can keep telling this story, here and in whatever other rooms I am given the chance to tell it, in the hope that it reaches someone who needs, most of all, simply to know they are not alone, and that the fight, however long and however exhausting, can in fact be won. I have come, over the years since all of this happened, to hold two truths side by side that once felt impossible to reconcile. The first is that the world beyond my childhood community, the English world I chose to enter at such cost, is full of genuine goodness, full of people like Denise and Patricia, and even, in her own imperfect and remorseful way, Linda Kowalski. People who showed up for me, who tried to make a flawed system work a little better for one struggling young woman standing in front of them. The second truth is that the systems built by even the most well-intentioned people can still cause enormous harm, quietly, invisibly, for years at a stretch, simply because no one along the chain was ever required to revisit an old judgment in light of new understanding. I do not think these two truths cancel each other out. I think they simply coexist, the way so many difficult truths in life seem to coexist, asking us to hold complexity rather than easy conclusions. I think in the end about that windowless room more often than I might like to admit, even now, so many years removed from the morning I sat there and first learned what had been written about me and my family without our knowledge or consent. I think about how close I came, in that moment, to simply accepting the label that had been placed on me, to letting the system's version of my story stand unchallenged simply because challenging it felt so exhausting, so uncertain, so unlikely to succeed against an institution so much larger and more powerful than one young woman with a stomachache and a stubborn heart. I am glad, looking back, that I did not accept it. I am glad I made those calls during my lunch breaks in that alley behind the ovens. I am glad Denise sat beside me in those waiting rooms with her unread paperback novel. I am glad I drove out to my mother's kitchen that Sunday afternoon and finally told her the whole truth of what had happened. I am glad, most of all, that I eventually walked out of that administrative office above the pharmacy with a clean file, carrying with me the hard-won knowledge that my own voice, spoken clearly and persistently enough, could eventually outweigh even 7 years of silent, unexamined suspicion. Thank you, truly, for sitting with me through this story of mine. If it moved you in any way at all, I would be so grateful if you would go back up and make certain you have liked this video, and if you have not yet subscribed, I would be so glad to have you stay with me for whatever story comes next. And please do not forget, tell me down in the comments where in the world you are watching or listening to this from tonight. I read every single comment that comes through, every one of them, and it means more to me than I can properly express to hear from all of you. Scattered as you are across so many places I will likely never see with my own eyes, taking the time to sit with an old woman and listen to her stories. I will see you in the next one.